Hello, my friends. Today I want to talk to you about personal identity. Do you have a personal identity? What constitutes your identity as a living organism? I started thinking about these questions after watching a car commercial, of all things. And in this commercial, it started with a highway with a bunch of cars driving on it, and they were all gray vehicles that all looked exactly the same. And the drivers were all sort of robotic looking, just looking straight forward, emotionless. And all of a sudden, the car that's being advertised, starts swooping, driving in between them, and the driver is really lively looking and excited, and the car is like bright red compared to the gray, boring cars that are all driving the same speed, looking the same way. And what this commercial is basically telling me is that if you buy this car, you are affirming your identity as a nonconformist. And in this day and age, a lot of identities, so to speak, are very similar to what this commercial is presenting, which is identities that are based on objects that you own, products that you own, the types of games that you play, the type of hobby that you have, what kind of diet you're on. People will base their identity around being a vegan. People will base their identity around being a car guy. I'm really into cars. And there's obviously nothing wrong with having passions and hobbies in your life. But when these sorts of surface level stuff becomes the core of who you are, even things like, I listen to this kind of music, or I'm a bicyclist. Some people will really get into being a bicyclist. That's like their identity. And people in the modern world will jump between these different identities as if they're fads. And a lot of postmodern philosophers basically have noticed this, and they assert that the self is no longer in existence. There's no longer a true self. Everybody has a personal identity which is fractured, and it's a multitude. It's a multiplicity, I think is the word they like to use. Multiplicity. And this even comes into effect with, the feminists who their identity becomes oppressed woman, or there's all kinds of different sort of niche fad identities. Even one's career or one's profession, which used to, for a long time, it used to be something that you would stick to just one profession for most of your life. Now, people will jump between 5, 6, 7 different professions, different careers. There'll be one thing, and then they'll go back to school and get a different degree and then become something else, or they'll switch jobs, or that entire industry or that entire business sector goes under, and there's just so much shifting, so much changing all the time that where is the permanence anymore? And for a lot of people, this sort of postmodern observation of the self being fractured, the self being a multiplicity, the self no longer really existing in some cases because it'll change from day to day, week to week, year to year. what is it, the true self then? If this is the case, if it can just shift and switch and morph and disappear, and if you lose your Lego collection, you're no longer a real Legoer, or things like this. What really could form the true core of someone's identity if it seems like everything that serves to build identity in the modern world is sort of shifting? What could remain essential? And I would say, if you are the type of person that is living in a city, working for a corporation, or not necessarily even working for one of the big corporations, which I think it's upwards of 50% of people in the United States now work for a large or very large corporation. The percent of people who work for smaller corporations is diminishing every year. But even those smaller corporations are often in many ways tied to and dependent upon the bigger corporations, especially for things like shipping, transport, finance. The whole system is built around these mega corporations, and you really can't get away from it if you want to be a part of that industrial market capital economy. So if you are the type of person that's living in this environment, then it really is something that would be challenging to get away from. How do you really define yourself in a meaningful way that will stick with you your whole life? How do you get away from these shifting sands of sort of fad identities? Because I think, and this is kind of, I'm being a little incoherent here. I'm not taking this down a logical train of thought, but I think that identity truly consists in two parts: biology and ecology. It is the biological organism of a certain species or type, and it is the environment that biological organism finds itself in and must survive in. Those two factors are what used to inform identity for people. So if you take, the European race, for instance, we could say broadly that the European race is a biological type, a certain biological species. But then when you have the Norwegians living along the strand flats and the fjords of Norway, you have the Swedes living on the plains, the lush, fertile plains of Sweden. You have the Germans living in the forests of Germany, or the Dutch living along the coastlands of Northern Europe. And this one biological organism, so to speak, in different ecological settings, took on different characteristics and different traits, and they became different nations. And for the longest time, while this was developing, each person's lifestyle and survival strategy was 100% dependent upon the environment of this unique location. And that is what developed differences over time. It's the reproductive isolation within a certain geographic period that lends itself to certain survival strategies. And because of the diversity of locations, the diversity of habitat, essentially, this one biological organism took on different characteristics, different qualities, and yet it's still, you can identify it as one sort of biological organism. So it's a two-part recipe, essentially, where you have the biology plus the ecology. And that, to me, is what used to define and differentiate different human groups. Now, all across the world, human groups are no longer differentiated in this manner. Suddenly, those differentiating factors have been made homogeneous across the world for probably billions of people at this point. Because if you're living in a city and you're working in this industrial market sort of capitalist economy, then somebody living in Beijing is not going to be much different in terms of in terms of ecology at this point compared to somebody living in New York. Functionally, there's very little difference between somebody living in a big city in Australia versus somebody living in a big city in Sweden. Very little difference. And so because the ecological differentiating element has been removed, suddenly people find themselves wanting an identity that has some sort of meaning and some sort of quality and characteristic to it above and beyond that. And I think it is because we have all been leveled in this way. We all have the same environment. We all live in this. We have the same survival strategies at this point, which is get along in this corporate industrial system, get a job, work for some corporation, and functionally there's not much difference between different groups at this point. So people still feel like they want to be distinguished. They feel like they still want to have some kind of sense of a unique identity in some way. They want to feel some kind of group cohesion. So they go to these fads. They go to these material-based identities. But to go back to the original question, what could possibly form the core of an identity that never really changes, that is truly essential? It is your biology and your ecology. People used to live and die in the same general region that they were born in, and that their fathers were born in, and their grandfathers were born in. And this process of survival and this sense of engagement with the environment, I think is why people back in the day never really had these thoughts of who am I really, and what is my identity, and what is right and what is wrong, and what is good and what is bad. Because life just made sense. Life was in tune with the instincts that developed through the biological organism within a certain ecology over thousands and thousands of years. Now those instincts are irrelevant. And that's what causes people to become so twisted in a lot of ways. So unless you're willing to remove yourself from this homogenizing environment, I don't really see any hope to break free from the effects of it. You cannot, you can't swim in the water and not get wet, so to speak. You can't live in the city, work for a big corporation, and not become an NPC bug man. I'm sorry. Thank you for watching.